My name is Natalie Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and until that Saturday night in October, I honestly believed I had a decent marriage. Not perfect, not storybook, not the kind people posted smug little anniversary captions about with filtered beach photos and paragraphs about soulmates, but decent, solid enough, I thought, stable enough to build a life on, stable enough to keep talking about kids someday without that word starting to sound like a lie. Stable enough that I believe my husband and I were still moving in the same direction, even if life had gotten busy and sharp around the edges. Turns out you can live inside a house for years and still not realize the foundation is cracked. Ethan and I had been together 8 years, married for 6. We lived in Riverside, in a comfortable suburban house with beige stucco walls, a 2-car garage, and a backyard just big enough for the dog we kept saying we'd adopt once things settled down. Things never settle down, by the way. That's one of the lies adults tell themselves while they're waiting for their real lives to begin. I worked as an aerospace engineer at a mid-sized firm in California. I made around $140,000 a year, which was more money than the version of me hauling textbooks across a state college campus and eating vending machine dinners had ever imagined. It was stable, respectable work. More than that, it mattered. That part always mattered to me. There is something deeply satisfying about knowing the calculations you stayed up until 2 in the morning, checking are now orbiting above the planet, that a component you helped design is part of something larger than yourself. My work was up there, floating through black silence, helping people speak across oceans, across mountains, across disasters. While other people bragged about quarterly profits and luxury purchases, I liked knowing my work helped somebody hear a voice they otherwise couldn't reach. But that kind of work doesn't always sound glamorous over dinner, especially not to people who only understand value when it arrives wearing a designer watch. Ethan worked in marketing for a boutique agency downtown. He made around $75,000 a year and had the kind of polished, likable energy that made strangers trust him immediately. He was smart, funny, good at small talk, and in the early years, I thought he was kind. Maybe he was, once. Or maybe he was just kind when kindness didn't cost him anything. From the outside, we looked like one of those couples people assumed had it figured out. Dual income, nice house, savings, investments, vacations to Hawaii and Costa Rica, where we smiled into sunlight and posted the photos everyone else was supposed to envy. But if you've ever been in a long relationship, you know appearances are cheap. And in our case, the real problem had a name. Ethan's older brother, Graham. Graham was 42, tall, handsome in that irritatingly polished way that made people assume he was important before he said a single word. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, the kind of handshake that felt rehearsed, the kind of man who entered a room already scanning for the most powerful person inside it. He ran a real estate development company, though ran was a generous word for what was essentially being handed a kingdom and then bragging about your leadership skills. His father-in-law had money, old money, country club money, vacation home in places normal people only see, online money. Graham liked to tell stories about grit and vision and instincts. He loved the phrase self-made in the same way children love superhero costumes, because if he said it enough times, maybe people would stop looking underneath. From the beginning, he made it clear he didn't think I was good enough for Ethan. He never said it outright at first. That would have required honesty. Instead, he worked in smaller cuts, the kind that looked harmless if you only saw one of them, but after years, left you bleeding in places nobody else could see. Aerospace engineering, huh? Steady work, I guess. Or with that lazy half smile of his, Ethan, you never wanted someone with a little more ambition? Or my personal favorite, must be nice having one of those government-adjacent jobs where you just clock in, clock out, and let taxpayers foot the bill. Some of us are out here actually building things. Always the same rhythm. Insult. Pause. Smile. Then, if my face changed even a little, relax, Natalie, I'm kidding. He was never kidding. People who are joking don't keep choosing the exact same bruise. And Ethan? He would laugh, or look down, or squeeze my knee under the table like that somehow counted as loyalty. Later, when we were alone, if I brought it up, he always had a version of the same excuse. That's just Graham being Graham. He's like that with everyone. He doesn't mean anything by it. Except he wasn't like that with everyone. He wasn't like that with Kyle, Amanda's husband, the attorney who had just made partner. He wasn't like that with the cousins in finance. He wasn't like that with doctors or investors or anyone else whose job title impressed him. He was like that with me. Only me. The woman whose work involved equations he couldn't understand and systems he couldn't reduce to cocktail party bragging rights. The woman who built things that couldn't be parked in a driveway or shown off at a country club. I should have seen what that meant years earlier. I should have paid attention to the fact that Ethan never really defended me, not once in a way that cost him comfort. I should have noticed how often I left family gatherings feeling smaller than when I arrived. I should have understood that love cannot survive long in a place where respect is optional. But love, at least the version I had, was full of excuses. So I kept the peace. That was the phrase, wasn't it? Keep the peace. Swallow your pride. Don't make it awkward. Don't ruin the night. Don't give Ethan a reason to be embarrassed by you. 6 years of that. 6 years of smiling at holidays while being carved up in polite company. 6 years of pretending the problem was Graham's mouth instead of Ethan's silence. The dinner that ended everything was supposed to be beautiful. Ethan's parents, Richard and Patricia, were renewing their vows after 40 years of marriage. 40 years. Long enough to sound holy when people said it out loud. They hosted the dinner at their house and turned it into an event. Catered meal from a fancy place downtown, white roses on every surface, candles flickering in little glass holders, soft music humming through hidden speakers. Patricia had clearly planned it for months. Every napkin folded just so, every plate gleaming. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine spread titled Timeless Family Elegance. There were 14 people total. Richard and Patricia at the head of the table. Ethan and me. His younger sister Amanda and her husband Kyle. Graham and his wife Elena. An aunt and uncle from San Diego. A few cousins filling in the rest, all of them dressed beautifully. All of them wearing those polished expressions families put on when they are determined to look functional. I knew the night was going to go badly before we even got inside. Graham pulled up in a brand new Tesla, black and gleaming under the driveway lights, and before the engine had properly gone quiet, he was already laughing loud enough for everyone to hear. Paid cash, he announced, swinging the door shut like a man arriving at his own premiere. Couldn't even fit it all in one briefcase, had to use 2 bags. Everyone gave the expected little laughs. Then he turned toward me. But you know how it is, Natalie. That line, that look. Like we both knew I could never possibly know how it was. I smiled because by then, smiling was muscle memory. Not exactly, I said. He laughed louder than necessary, like I had just confirmed the joke for him. Ethan stood beside me with one hand in his pocket, staring at the car with a smile that was too neutral to read. I remember waiting half a second, just half a second, for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. And that tiny moment, trivial as it sounds, lodged under my skin. Because disappointment doesn't always arrive as a grand betrayal. Sometimes it is just the same silence, again and again, until one day you can no longer pretend not to hear it. Dinner began pleasantly enough. For about 20 minutes, everything almost felt normal. Patricia beamed in that fragile, emotional way women do when they are trying very hard not to cry in front of everyone. Richard stood and gave a speech about 40 years of marriage, about partnership, compromise, choosing each other, even on difficult days. He talked about building a life, brick by brick, and there was something sincere in his voice that made the room soften. People raised glasses. Some eyes got watery. Even I felt moved, which now feels almost cruel in hindsight. Because there we all were, celebrating commitment while sitting on top of rot. Then the main course arrived, and with it Graham's need to own the room. "So, Natalie," he said loudly, slicing into his fillet like he was performing a demonstration. "Still working on those, what do you call them, rocket parts?" The old tightening started in my chest. There it is, I thought. Right on schedule. "Satellite components," I said evenly. "Communication systems, mostly. The kind that help with remote connectivity and emergency infrastructure." Right. He flicked his fork dismissively. "Sounds thrilling." The table quieted almost instantly. People knew this pattern. They had seen it before. At Christmas. At birthdays. At barbecues. Nobody ever stopped it. They just got still and hoped it would pass over them. "How's the pay these days?" Graham asked. "Still low 6 figures?" You could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway. I kept my face calm. "I do well?" "Fine," he said, dragging out the word. "That's exactly what I mean. Fine." He leaned back and turned toward Ethan like he was including him in some important mentoring conversation. "Don't you ever want more than fine?" he asked. "Don't you want exceptional? Don't you want a partner who can really give you the life you deserve?" Ethan shifted in his chair. Just slightly. That was it. No sharp look, no warning, no, knock it off. "No, that's my wife you're talking about." "Nothing." Elena reached for Graham's arm. "Maybe not tonight." But Graham was already warming to it, already enjoying the attention. "Look at what I've built for my family," he said. "The house in the hills, the pool, the view, the cars, Europe twice a year. That's what real ambition looks like. That's what a man should be able to provide, not just adequate." My jaw tightened so hard it hurt. I kept my voice level anyway. "Different people measure success differently." "Of course they do," he said, smiling. "Some people measure it by the size of their ambition, or in your case, the lack of it." That got him a sharp look from Richard. "Enough," his father said, and there was more steel in his voice than I was used to hearing. But Graham only lifted his hands in fake innocence. "Dad, I'm being honest. Natalie's a nice woman. I've never said otherwise. But nice doesn't build a future. Ethan could have had anyone. He's smart, charming, successful. And instead, he married someone who's content to coast along in a middling career." Middling. That word landed like a slap. For a second, the whole room seemed to tilt. Because my career was a lot of things. Demanding. Technical. Precise. Exhausting. Meaningful. It was not middling. I had worked every inch of the way for it. Undergraduate engineering at a state school while working part-time because my parents couldn't pay my way. Graduate school on caffeine, anxiety, and stubbornness. Years of 60-hour weeks proving myself in rooms full of men who assumed I had been hired to fill a quota. 3 patents. Projects in orbit. Systems that had helped coordinate relief efforts after natural disasters. Real work. Work that touched lives I would never see. And this man, this pampered fraud in a tailored jacket, was calling it middling while his own empire was built on smoke. Across the table, Ethan still said nothing. I looked at him then. Really looked. And there he was, staring at his plate. Not angry at his brother. Not protective of me. Just uncomfortable. As if my humiliation were an inconvenience happening near him. Something cold moved through me. Not rage, not yet. Recognition. The kind that comes right before a door closes inside you. Graham kept talking, drunk on his own performance. "At family gatherings," he said, "we talk about what everyone's doing. Kyle made partner. The cousins are doing interesting things. I close another development deal, and then we get to Natalie and it's what? She's still doing that same satellite thing. Nothing new, nothing exciting, just fine." I waited. I hate that part most, even now. Not what he said, but that I still waited. For Ethan to save me from hearing the rest. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and looked down again. That was the moment. Not the shouting that came later. Not the divorce papers. Not the hotel room. That was the moment my marriage ended. Because something in me finally understood that a woman can survive cruelty a lot longer than she should. But indifference from the person standing closest to her. That is what kills love. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The candles still flickered. The roses still smelled sweet. Patricia's beautiful table still looked perfect, like a stage set moments before a bomb goes off. "You know what, Graham?" I said quietly. "I think you've made your point." His smirk widened. He thought he was winning. He thought I was about to crack in some small, pathetic way he could laugh about for years. He had no idea I was done being polite, and no idea that I had been sitting on a truth far uglier than anything he had ever said to me. I stood up slowly. Not dramatically. Not like someone in a movie about to flip a table and start screaming. Just slowly, carefully, like if I moved too fast, whatever had finally settled inside me might scatter before I could use it. The room went still in a way that felt unnatural, as if every person at that table sensed the air had changed, but didn't yet understand how badly. Graham leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over it, his expression smug and loose. He thought I was about to do exactly what he'd always wanted, to lose control in front of an audience, to become emotional enough that he could dismiss me as unstable, oversensitive, dramatic. Poor Natalie finally snapped. I could almost hear him telling that story later, only he wasn't going to get the chance. I walked around the table toward him. My heels sank softly into Patricia's dining room carpet. Every eye followed me. Nobody spoke. Elena's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Amanda's lips parted slightly. Kyle watched me with this odd stillness, like he had already guessed what kind of moment this was about to become. I stopped beside Graham's chair and looked down at him. Up close, I could see the confidence still sitting on his face like it belonged there. That easy superiority, that shine he wore in public, built from expensive grooming and family myth. The shine of a man who had never once believed the room could turn on him. "The reason you've been able to close all those big development deals," I said, my voice calm enough to make several people blink, "is because your father-in-law has been funneling pension fund money into your projects." At first, he just stared at me. Like the sentence itself didn't make sense. Like his brain needed an extra second to catch up because the possibility that I knew had never entered his imagination. I continued before he could interrupt. I know that because I handle aerospace contracts for one of the same institutional portfolios tied to that fund. I've seen the documentation. I've seen the lending structures. I've seen the shell entities the money moves through before it lands where it was never supposed to go. The change in his face was instant. Not subtle, not deniable. 1 second smug, the next drained. It was like watching someone yank a sheet off a carefully staged set and reveal the rotten beams underneath. Elena's fingers loosened. Her wineglass slipped and struck the edge of her plate, spilling red across Patricia's white tablecloth in a slow, spreading stain that looked too much like blood. Graham let out a short laugh, but it came out wrong. Thin, cracked. "That's insane," he said. "That's a lie." "No," I said, "it isn't." Richard pushed his chair back so violently it scraped against the floor. "What is she talking about?" he demanded. "Graham." His son turned towards him with the offended look of a man outraged by being questioned. But the performance was already failing. There was too much panic in his eyes now, too much calculation. "It's business," Graham snapped. "You wouldn't understand the structure. Natalie doesn't understand it either. She's trying to sound important because she's embarrassed." I almost smiled at that. After years of being called small, simple, lesser, now suddenly I was too informed to ignore. "I understand enough," I said, "to know that the interest rates your company got don't exist in the real market. I understand enough to know retirees' savings were supposed to be in secure placements, not leveraged to prop up your vanity projects. I understand enough to know your numbers only look healthy on paper because somebody has been protecting you from risk that ordinary people would actually have to carry." Elena turned to her husband so fast her chair legs screeched. "Tell me she's wrong." "Baby!" "No," her voice shook. "Do not baby me. Tell me she's wrong." Graham stood halfway, then sat back down again, like he didn't know whether aggression or charm would save him faster. "It's creative financing," he said finally, and even he seemed to realize too late how bad that sounded. The silence after that was so complete it felt physical. Creative financing. There it was. Not a denial. Not outrage. Not confusion. A shrug dressed up in business language. Richard's face changed. I had never seen a human being age that fast in real time. The color drained from him. The lines around his mouth deepened. Patricia made a small sound from the end of the table. Not quite a sob, not quite disbelief, but something between the two. Ethan turned to me then, not with concern, not with understanding, with horror, but not horror at what Graham had done. Horror that I had said it. "Natalie," he whispered sharply, grabbing my wrist hard enough to make me flinch. "What are you doing?" I looked down at his hand, then at his face, and I remember thinking, with a clarity so clean it was almost peaceful, there you are. There was my husband, not missing, not conflicted, not trapped between loyalties. Right there, choosing. "What I should have done months ago," I said, pulling my hand free. "I'm telling the truth." He stared at me like I had become dangerous, and maybe I had. Not dangerous in the way they would describe later. Emotional, reckless, cruel. Dangerous in the way truth always is to people who survive by keeping it buried. The room exploded all at once. Elena was crying now, demanding details, asking how long this had been going on, whether her father was involved, whether their entire life had been financed with stolen money. Graham tried to talk over her, over me, over everyone, throwing out words like misunderstanding and standard practice and overreaction as if volume could replace credibility. Richard stepped into the hallway with his phone already in his hand. I could hear the clipped edge in his voice as he called someone important enough that even Graham went still when he realized what his father was doing. Patricia sat at the head of the table, staring at the red stain spreading across the white cloth she had probably ironed herself that afternoon. Her candles still burned. The roses were still perfect. The music was still playing softly through hidden speakers, absurdly elegant over the sound of a family coming apart. Amanda kept saying, "Oh my God," under her breath, like a person praying without faith. Kyle didn't speak immediately. He just watched Graham with a look I didn't understand yet, something grim and unsurprised, like this was not the first time he had seen the mask slip. And Ethan stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped. "You had no right," he said to me. That sentence hit harder than any insult Graham had ever thrown. No right. Not, "Is it true?" Not, "My God, how serious is this?" Not, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Just accusation. Because in his mind, even now, the greater crime was exposure. "Your brother has spent 6 years humiliating me," I said, turning fully toward him. "Every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner. He's mocked my work, my income, my worth, and every single time you let him. That is not the issue right now. It has always been the issue right now. My voice rose then, not into screaming, but into something sharper, clearer. Years of swallowed anger finally finding shape. You all sat here while he called me middling. Meanwhile, he's using pension money like his own personal piggy bank, and somehow I'm the one who crossed a line? Because you did it here, Ethan shot back, at my parents' vow renewal dinner, in front of everyone. I laughed then. It came out bitter and short and not at all like myself. In front of everyone? That's rich. Graham humiliates me in front of everyone for years, but the moment I tell the truth in the same room, suddenly public humiliation matters to you. Graham was joking. I turned and looked at him fully. I wanted even then for him to hear how ridiculous that sounded. How childish. How shameful. But he believed it, or needed to believe it. Sometimes the difference doesn't matter. No, I said, he wasn't. Graham slammed a hand on the table. This is insane. You think you can destroy my reputation because you're jealous? I faced him again. Destroy your reputation, I said softly. I didn't build it. I'm just describing what's underneath it. Elena recoiled like I had struck her, not because I'd hurt her, but because some part of her knew I was right. She looked at her husband with naked revulsion now. How much of our life is fake? She asked. The house, the cars, the trips, my father? Graham's expression flashed from panic to anger. Everybody makes money, he snapped. Everybody benefits. You think any of these people complaining would care if the returns kept coming? That's enough, Richard barked from the hallway, stepping back into the room. He sounded different now, colder. Do not say another word. There are moments when power leaves a person so visibly you can almost watch the temperature in the room drop. That was one of them. Graham looked at his father, and for the first time all night, he seemed smaller. Not humbled, just exposed. Patricia finally broke, crying openly now, her voice trembling as she asked Richard what was happening, what this meant, how bad it was. He didn't answer her directly. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe the truth was already too large to hold inside polite conversation. Amanda moved toward her mother. Kyle stood too, but his attention stayed on me for a second. He gave me the faintest nod. Tiny, barely there, but I saw it. And in that room full of silence and blame and panic, that nearly invisible gesture felt like the first honest thing anyone had given me all night. Then Ethan stepped closer. His face was flushed, eyes bright with the kind of anger people use when they feel their control slipping. You need to apologize, he said. I actually thought I had misheard him. The room had gotten so loud, so fractured, I assumed my brain was filling in something absurd. But then he said it again, louder. Apologize to Graham right now. Everything stopped. Even the crying seemed to pause. I stared at my husband and tried to find the man I had married somewhere inside his face. The man who once sat with me on our back porch eating takeout noodles and talking about baby names. The man who used to rub the back of my neck when I worked late. The man I had defended in my own mind over and over when the evidence kept stacking against him. Maybe that man had existed once. Maybe he never had. Either way, the one standing in front of me now was not on my side. Apologize, he repeated, voice shaking, for making those accusations in front of everyone. They're not accusations, I said. They're facts. You don't know that. I do. You humiliated my family. There it was again. My family. Not our marriage. Not your wife. Not the truth. My family. And suddenly, every year of our relationship rearranged itself into something ugly but coherent. Every time he'd asked me to let it go. Every time he'd laughed nervously instead of defending me. Every time he'd made me feel unreasonable for wanting basic respect. It all made sense at once. I had never been standing beside him. I had been standing outside the circle, hoping one day he would let me in. Your brother humiliated me for years, I said, and you watched. That's not the same. It is exactly the same. The only difference is that tonight he picked the wrong target. Graham muttered something under his breath, probably another insult, but I barely heard him. The room around us had narrowed. It was just Ethan and me now, and the wreckage between us. Apologize, he said one last time, and his voice cracked with desperation. Or leave. I blinked. Maybe because the sentence was so naked. No euphemism. No softness. No attempt to hide behind timing or stress or family pressure. Just a choice placed in my hands like a weapon. Apologize to the man who had demeaned me for years. Or get out. I looked around the room. At Graham, pale and sweating. At Elena, mascara tracking down her cheeks as she stared at her husband like she no longer recognized him. At Richard, standing rigid with his phone in one hand and devastation in his face. At Patricia, sobbing quietly at her own ruined table. At Amanda, frozen, At Kyle, jaw tight, eyes tired. At all of them. The whole shining, polished family system built on image, silence, hierarchy, and fear. Then I looked back at Ethan. Your house? I asked quietly. He had said it in the heat of the moment a minute earlier. Get out of my house. And maybe he didn't even realize I'd heard the first version before he tried to correct it. Our house, he said quickly. But it was too late. Words like that don't come from nowhere. They come from what someone believes when they stop editing themselves. The house I've paid most of the mortgage on for 6 years? I asked. That house? He looked away for half a second, and that was answer enough. I felt strangely calm then. Not numb, not broken, clear. The kind of calm that only comes after the worst thing has already happened, and your body finally understands there is nothing left to save. I'll pack tomorrow, I said. His expression shifted instantly. He hadn't expected that. He expected a fight. Tears. Bargaining. Shame. He expected the old version of me. Natalie, don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. I took off my wedding ring. Not with ceremony, not with trembling hands. Just a smooth pull of metal over skin that had worn it so long it had left a pale mark behind. I set it down on the table beside the spilled wine. You can have your family tonight, I said. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce. His face went white. Divorce? He said, and for the first time all evening, he sounded afraid. Natalie, wait. I didn't mean... Yes, I said, you did. He took a step toward me, but I stepped back. You meant exactly what you said. You just didn't think I would finally believe you. The room was silent again. Not stunned the way it had been when I exposed Graham. This was different. This was the silence that comes when people realize the person they thought they understood has reached the point of no return. I picked up my purse from the chair. My hands were still steady. I remember that detail because it stayed with me later. In the hotel room, in the elevator, in the parking lot, under cold yellow lights. Steady, as if some hidden part of me had been preparing for this for years. No one stopped me. Not Patricia. Not Richard. Not Amanda. Not even Ethan. Maybe because deep down, they all knew I wasn't the one blowing up the night. I was just the one refusing to keep carrying the lie. When I walked out the front door, the air felt colder than it had earlier. I crossed the driveway alone, behind me, through the windows. I could still see candlelight trembling against the glass. The house looked warm and beautiful and almost peaceful from the outside. That was the thing about that family. From the outside, they had always looked beautiful. I drove to a hotel downtown and checked into a room on the 4th floor. The woman at the front desk smiled politely and asked if I needed anything else, and I nearly laughed because how do you answer that question after your marriage ends between the salad and dessert course? I sat on the edge of the bed for hours. Didn't cry. Didn't call anyone. Didn't turn on the television. I just stared at the wall while the room hummed softly around me and tried to understand how 8 years could collapse in 20 minutes. Not because of an affair. Not because of some secret second life. But because when truth entered the room, my husband chose the lie. And somewhere between the white roses and the spilled wine and his voice telling me to apologize, I finally understood something I should have learned long before. The moment a person asks you to betray yourself so everyone else can stay comfortable, the relationship is already over. The next morning felt unreal. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. More like everything had been drained of meaning, and I was moving through it on instinct alone. I went back to the house early before anyone else would be there. I knew Ethan would still be at his parents' place, wrapped up in the aftermath, surrounded by voices telling him some version of the same story, that I had overreacted, that I had embarrassed the family, that I had taken things too far. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew how that narrative would sound. The house was quiet when I walked in, still, almost eerily calm, like it had no idea what had happened inside it the night before. I stood in the entryway for a moment, keys still in my hand, and let myself look around. Our house. Except it didn't feel like that anymore. It felt like a set, a place where a version of my life had been performed. I walked upstairs and started packing. No hesitation. No pausing to hold things and reminisce. Clothes went into suitcases, important documents into a folder, laptop, external drives, work files, all of it gathered with the kind of precision I used at work when something critical needed to be secured. I left everything else. The couch we'd picked out together in Costa Mesa. The framed photos from vacations where we'd smiled like we believed in what we were building. The decorative pieces Ethan had insisted made the place feel finished. I didn't want any of it, because suddenly every object felt like evidence of something I had misunderstood. By the time I left, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. You couldn't tell anything had changed. Except everything had. I rented a small apartment across town that same week. functional, bare, neutral in a way that required nothing from me emotionally. A bed, a table, a couch that came with the place, blank walls, a kitchen that echoed slightly when I moved around in it. It was perfect. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the air, no subtle judgment, no anticipation of the next comment, the next gathering, the next moment I would have to shrink myself to keep the peace. Just silence. And me. The silence was strange at first. Then it became relief. The fallout started fast. Faster than I expected. Within days, the story inside that dining room had started to leak outward. Because the truth about people like Graham, it doesn't stay contained once it's exposed. It spreads. And what I had said at that table wasn't speculation. It was the beginning of something that had already been building behind the scenes. Within a week, Elena filed for divorce. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how quickly everything else unraveled after that. The pension fund issue was bigger than I'd thought. Much bigger. Graham hadn't just been getting favorable loans. He had been actively moving money through layers of shell companies, creating distance between the source and the destination. So the whole structure looked legitimate on paper. But it wasn't. Not even close. When the investigation officially began, it didn't take long before the entire thing started collapsing. Projects stalled. Investors panicked. Documents surfaced. The kind of documents that don't leave room for interpretation. His development company folded within a month. Just folded. Like something hollow finally losing the support it never had. And his father-in-law? He was pulled into it almost immediately. Turns out when you build success on systems designed to hide truth, those same systems become evidence when someone starts digging. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national, because nothing spreads faster than a story about wealthy people abusing power. I saw Graham's face on TV one night, not the polished version, not the man in tailored suits and rehearsed confidence. A mugshot, flat lighting, tired eyes, no control. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, not satisfied, not shocked. Just certain, because this had always been there. It had just taken someone refusing to stay quiet for it to surface. 2 weeks after I moved out, I got a call from Kyle. I almost didn't answer, but something in me was curious. He wasn't someone who called without reason. "Hey," he said when I picked up. His voice was quieter than usual. "Do you have a minute?" "Yeah." There was a pause, long enough that I could hear him breathing. I should have said something years ago. I leaned back against my kitchen counter, phone pressed to my ear. "About what?" "About Graham." "Of course." He exhaled slowly. "I've watched him do this to people for as long as I've known the family," he said. "Not just you, but you were the only one he kept targeting consistently." I didn't say anything. I just listened, because I had spent years wondering if I was exaggerating, if I was too sensitive, if I was misreading things. Now someone else was saying it out loud. "He lies about his accomplishments," Kyle continued, "takes credit for things he didn't do, inflates everything. And if someone doesn't play along, he tears them down until they either fall in line or stop showing up." "That sounds familiar," I said quietly. "Yeah," a short, humorless laugh. "I bet it does." Another pause. "The worst part," he said, "the family knows. Not consciously, maybe, but deep down, they know something's off. They've just built their whole system around protecting him." That hit harder than I expected, because it explained everything. Not just Graham. All of it. Ethan's silence, Patricia's careful avoidance, Richard's selective authority, Amanda's defensiveness. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, a structure, a family that had decided, consciously or not, that preserving the image mattered more than confronting the truth. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you're the first person who ever actually stood up to him," Kyle said. "And I wanted you to know you weren't crazy." That word landed differently than anything else he'd said. Crazy. Because that's what it starts to feel like after years of being dismissed. Like you're imagining things, overreacting, misunderstanding. "You weren't," he added, "and I'm sorry I didn't say that sooner." I closed my eyes for a second and felt something shift, not closure, but validation, the kind that doesn't fix what happened, but confirms that what you experienced was real. The divorce process started shortly after, and if I had still held on to any illusion about Ethan at that point, it didn't survive long. He didn't just want the house. He wanted everything. Savings, accounts, retirement, all of it. His lawyer argued that I had caused emotional damage to him and his family, that exposing Graham publicly constituted a form of harm, that I should compensate for the fallout. I remember sitting in that office, listening to those words and thinking, this is who he really is. Not the man who stayed silent at dinner. The man who, even now, was trying to rewrite reality to protect himself. Fortunately, I had documentation, years of it, mortgage records showing I had paid more than half. bank statements showing I covered most of our expenses. And the final blow? Evidence that Ethan had invested a significant portion of our joint savings into Graham's development projects, without telling me. Money that had disappeared along with Graham's company. When everything was laid out in court, the narrative collapsed. There was no emotional abuse, no reckless behavior, just facts. Clear, unavoidable. We ended up splitting everything 50-50, which in reality meant I walked away with more than what I had originally contributed. But I didn't feel like I had won anything. I just felt done. 4 months. That's how long it took to legally end 8 years. The strangest part came later. Not during the investigation, not during the divorce, but in the quiet moments after everything settled, because that's when you start asking different questions. Not what happened, but why did I stay? And the answers aren't always comfortable. About 6 months after the divorce, I was at a grocery store on a Sunday afternoon. Nothing special. Just picking up food for the week. Normal life. The kind of normal I hadn't realized I'd missed. I was standing in the produce section, turning an avocado in my hand, trying to decide if it was ripe enough, when I heard someone say my name. Natalie? I turned. And for a second, I didn't recognize her. Patricia. She looked older, not just physically, worn, like something inside her had shifted permanently. Hi, I said. We stood there, between stacks of fruit and people comparing prices, in a place that had nothing to do with family dinners or expectations or image. Can we talk for a minute? She asked. Her voice was quiet, careful, like she wasn't sure she had the right. I nodded. We stepped a little to the side, out of the flow of people, and she looked at me with eyes that were already filling. You were right, she said. Just like that. No build-up. No hesitation. About Graham, she continued. About all of it. I didn't respond immediately. I just let her speak. Richard and we knew something was wrong, she said, for years, but we didn't want to see it. We told ourselves it was ambition, drive, that he just needed to be managed. She swallowed. We raised him to believe he was special. That rules didn't apply to him the same way, and we let that belief destroy him. There was no defense in her voice, no justification, just recognition and regret. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you deserve better, she said. Her voice broke on that last word. From all of us, but especially from Ethan. That name still landed strangely in my chest. Not painful, just distant. He was so afraid of disappointing us, she continued, of going against the family, that he forgot how to be a partner to you. I looked down at the avocado still in my hand, then back at her. How is he? I asked. I didn't expect myself to ask that, but I did. She hesitated. Alone, she said. Simple. Honest. He moved out after the divorce, she added. He's working a lot, doesn't see people much. I think he's trying to figure out who he is without all of this. I nodded slowly. There was a flicker of something in me. Not regret, not longing, just a quiet acknowledgement of what could have been, if things had been different. I hope he figures it out, I said, and I meant it. Patricia wiped her eyes. I know it's too late, she said, but I'm sorry for what Graham did, for what we all allowed. I gave her a small nod, because what else was there to say? Some apologies don't fix anything, but they still matter. As I walked away, I realized something. For years, I had been trying to earn a place in that family, trying to be accepted, trying to prove my worth. And in the end, the only thing that changed everything was the moment I stopped trying. Graham's sentencing came through about 2 months after that conversation. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. 14 years in federal prison, plus restitution that would follow him long after he got out, if he ever managed to rebuild anything at all. I watched part of the sentencing online. Not the whole thing. Just enough. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was something colder than anger in the way she spoke. Controlled, precise, almost clinical. She called it one of the most egregious abuses of pension funds she had seen in 2 decades. She talked about retirees, teachers, firefighters, nurses, people who had spent 30 years trusting that their savings would be there when they needed them, and how that trust had been treated like a resource to exploit. Graham stood there in an orange jumpsuit, hands clasped in front of him, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. No smirk, no performance, no room left to control the narrative, just consequences. His father-in-law had already taken a plea deal. 5 years. Cooperation in exchange for testimony. The empire they had built, the houses, the status, the image, gone in less than a year. 60 years of old money prestige reduced to headlines and asset seizures. Funny how fast that happens when truth finally gets a chance to breathe. Richard called me the day after the sentencing. First time we'd spoken directly since everything. Natalie, he said. His voice sounded older, Not just tired. Worn down in a way that comes from realizing you were wrong for a very long time. He's going to prison, he added, like I hadn't already heard. I know, I said. There was a long pause. Then he exhaled. You were right, he said, about everything. I didn't answer right away. Because those words, they don't land the way people think they will. They don't feel like victory. They feel like something that arrived far too late. We made excuses for him, Richard continued, for years. Every time he crossed a line, we told ourselves it wasn't serious, that it was just ambition, just Graham being Graham. A bitter breath. That phrase doesn't sound the same anymore. No, it doesn't. I'm sorry, he said. And for a moment, I could hear something in his voice that reminded me of the man who had given that speech about 40 years of marriage. Not perfect, but sincere. I am too, I said. And I meant that. Not for Graham. He had earned everything that was coming. But for Richard and Patricia, because loving someone you raised while watching them become something destructive, that's its own kind of consequence. Before he hung up, he said one more thing. For what it's worth, you were the best thing that ever happened to my son. I didn't know how to respond to that. So I didn't. Work changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Over the months after the divorce, something in me shifted. It showed up in small ways first. I spoke up more in meetings, pushed back when something didn't make sense, didn't soften my opinions to make them easier to accept, didn't apologize for taking up space, and people noticed. About 3 months after everything finalized, my boss called me into his office. I assumed it was about a project. We'd been having issues with the thermal system design, and I'd been putting in extra hours trying to fix it. Instead, he slid a folder across the desk. Senior systems engineer, he said. I blinked. 15% raise, your own team, and first pass at the defense contract we've been chasing. I just stared at him for a second. What changed? I asked. He leaned back slightly. You did. That was it. No long explanation. No corporate speech. Just that. You've been different these last few months, he added. More direct, more confident. You don't hesitate when something's wrong anymore. He tapped the folder. Whatever happened, keep it. The raise bumped me up to $161,000. Not flashy. Not 2 bags of cash flashy, but real, earned, clean. I met Daniel about 4 months after the divorce. Not through friends, not through some carefully planned setup, just organically. He was a high school physics teacher, which meant he had the patience of a saint and the ability to explain complex things without making people feel stupid. We started with coffee, then dinner, then more dinners. And somewhere along the way, I realized something that felt almost foreign. I didn't have to shrink around him. I didn't have to edit myself. I didn't have to prepare for subtle digs or sideways comments. When I talked about work, he listened. Actually listened. Asked questions. Followed the answers. One night, I came home frustrated about a design flaw we'd found. Most people would have tuned out after 10 seconds. Daniel sat with me for nearly 2 hours, just working through it with me, asking questions, sketching ideas on a napkin like it was the most normal thing in the world. At one point, he looked up and said, "You know what I love about what you do?" "What?" "You're putting things in space that help people connect. That's incredible." Simple, direct, no comparison, no hierarchy, just appreciation. I didn't realize how much I had needed that until I heard it. About 8 months after the divorce, I ran into Ethan. It happened at an Italian restaurant downtown. Daniel and I were sitting at a corner table, halfway through a bottle of wine, talking about taking a weekend trip to San Diego. I looked up, and there he was, standing near the entrance. He saw me at the same time, and froze. For a second, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Like the version of himself he used to present so easily had worn off. He was alone, no friends, no date, just him, and the quiet realization of what his life looked like now. He glanced at Daniel, then back at me. There was something in his expression, not anger, not even regret exactly, just awareness, like he finally understood something he hadn't been able to see before. I gave him a small nod. Nothing more, no conversation, no scene, no closure speech. He held my gaze for a second, then turned and walked out. Daniel watched him go. "X?" he asked. "Yeah." He took a sip of wine. "He looks like he lost something important." I smiled slightly. "He did." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. No questions. No pressure. Just presence. Kyle called me again not long after that. He and Amanda had separated. Not because of a single moment, but because of everything that came after. "She still thinks you destroyed the family," he said. I sighed. "Of course she does. She keeps saying things would have gone back to normal if you'd just stayed quiet." I leaned back in my chair. "Would they have?" "No," he said. "They would have just stayed hidden." There was a pause. "I think she knows that," he added. "She just can't admit it." Some truths are harder to face than others, especially when they force you to rewrite your entire understanding of the people you love. A few weeks later, I got an email from one of my old professors. Short, simple. One of my former students is interning at your company, it said. She told me you spoke at her high school a few years ago. Said it's the reason she chose aerospace. I read that email 3 times. I didn't even remember that talk. But apparently, while I was busy believing I was middling, I had been shaping someone else's future. Funny how that works. So that's where everything ended up. Graham is in federal prison. 14 years. His father-in-law is serving time too. Elena rebuilt her life somewhere else. Amanda and Kyle went their separate ways. Ethan is alone, trying, I assume, to understand how everything unraveled. And me? I have a job I'm proud of, a promotion I earned, a partner who respects me, and a life that feels honest, not perfect, not polished, not designed for other people's approval, but real. The satellites I helped design are still up there, still orbiting, still doing exactly what they were meant to do, helping people connect. Turns out there's nothing middling about that. And there's definitely nothing small about finally choosing yourself.